A woman stood in the Montana dust, hollow-eyed and trembling, every bone in her body screaming for food she didn't have. She'd walked 3 days straight to reach this ranch, knowing it was either beg for work or die trying. When the man who owned the place finally stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand and eyes cold as winter stone, she didn't flinch. She met his stare and said the only thing she had left to say. "I'll work harder than any man you've ever hired. Just don't send me back out there to starve." If you want to know whether she survived, whether mercy exists in a world this brutal, then stay with me to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The ranch sat low against the Montana horizon, like something carved out of bone and silence. No trees softened its edges. No neighbors broke the long stretch of grassland that rolled out in every direction until it met the mountains, blue and distant and indifferent. The house was small, timber-framed, weathered gray by wind that never stopped. The barn leaned slightly to one side, as if it had given up trying to stand straight years ago. A single horse grazed near the fence line, flicking its tail at flies. Rhett Calloway stood on the porch, one hand resting on the post, watching the figure approach from the east. He'd seen it an hour ago, when it was just a dark smudge against the pale dirt road. Now it was close enough to make out details. A woman. Thin. Moving slow, like each step cost her something she couldn't afford to give. He didn't move, didn't call out, just watched. She stopped at the gate, swaying a little, and looked up at him. Her dress was torn at the hem, caked with dust. Her hair hung in matted strands around a face that might have been pretty once, before hunger carved it down to angles and shadows. Her eyes were the worst part, not because they were desperate. Rhett had seen desperate plenty of times, but because they were still fighting. "I'm looking for work," she said. Her voice cracked halfway through. Rhett didn't answer right away. He studied her the way he studied everything, slow, careful, looking for what didn't fit. She had no horse, no pack, no canteen that he could see, which meant she'd walked here with nothing, and that was either brave or stupid, and he wasn't sure yet which one it was. "Don't need help?" he said finally. She nodded, like she'd expected that. "I'll work harder than any man you've ever hired. Just don't send me back out there to starve." The words came out flat, not pleading, a statement of fact. Rhett felt something shift in his chest, small and uncomfortable, like a stone rolling loose. "You got people?" he asked. "No." "Town you came from?" "Doesn't matter. I'm not going back." He leaned against the post, arms crossed. "You run from something, or something run you off?" Her jaw tightened. "Does it change your answer?" It didn't. Or maybe it did. Rhett wasn't sure. He'd lived alone on this land for 5 years, ever since his father died and left him a place that was more work than it was worth. He didn't like people much, didn't trust them, but he also didn't like the idea of watching someone walk back out into nothing and wondering later if they'd made it. "You know how to cook?" he asked. She blinked. "Yes." "Clean? Mend things?" "Yes." "Cattle work?" She hesitated. "I can learn." Rhett pushed off the post and came down the steps, boots thudding on the dry wood. Up close, she looked worse. Her hands were blistered, nails cracked and dirty. There was a bruise on her collarbone, faded yellow-green, and another along her jaw that was fresher. He didn't ask about those either. "Name's Rhett Calloway," he said. "You work here. You pull your weight. I don't care if you're tired. I don't care if it's hard. You do the job or you leave. Understood?" She nodded. "Understood. What's your name?" "Alara Quinn." He turned and started walking toward the house. "Come on, then." She followed, stumbling once but catching herself. Rhett didn't look back. If she couldn't keep up now, she wouldn't last a week. Inside, the house smelled like dust and old coffee. The front room was small. Table, 2 chairs, a stove in the corner that hadn't been cleaned in a month. A narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a washroom that barely fit a tin tub. Everything was functional. Nothing was comfortable. Rhett gestured toward the table. "Sit." Alara sank into the chair like her legs had been waiting for permission to give out. He pulled a tin of beans from the shelf, dumped them into a pot, and set it on the stove without a word. While it heated, he sliced bread, thick, uneven pieces, and set them in front of her along with a cup of water. She stared at the food like it might disappear if she blinked. "Eat," Rhett said. She picked up the bread with shaking hands and bit into it, chewed slow, swallowed, took another bite. He watched her for a moment, then turned back to the stove, stirring the beans until they were hot enough. He scooped them into a bowl and set it down in front of her. "Slow," he said, "or you'll be sick." She nodded but didn't stop eating. Rhett poured himself coffee and sat across from her, saying nothing. The silence stretched out, broken only by the scrape of her spoon against the bowl and the wind rattling the window frame. When she finished, she set the spoon down and looked at him. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Rhett said. "You haven't worked a day." "I will." He believed her. Or maybe he just wanted to. "Back room's yours," he said, nodding toward the hallway. "There's a bed. Blankets in the chest. You start tomorrow at dawn." Alara stood, swaying again, and Rhett caught her elbow before she tipped over. She pulled back fast, like his touch burned, and he let go just as quick. "I'm fine," she said. "You're half dead. Get some sleep." She didn't argue, just walked down the hall, slow and careful, and disappeared into the room. Rhett heard the door close, the creak of the bed frame. Then nothing. He sat there a while longer, staring into his coffee, wondering what the hell he'd just done. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of morning that felt like it might never warm up. Rhett was already outside when Alara stepped onto the porch, dressed in the same torn dress, hair pulled back in a loose knot. She looked steadier than she had yesterday, but not by much. "Chickens first," Rhett said, handing her a bucket. "Coop's behind the barn. Gather the eggs, check the water, throw out feed. Don't let them peck you." She took the bucket and started walking. Rhett watched her go, then turned his attention to the fence line he'd been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. The wire was rusted through in 3 places, sagging where the posts had shifted. He worked methodically, pulling staples, stretching new wire, hammering it tight. The sun climbed higher, and the wind picked up, carrying the smell of dry grass and livestock. An hour later, Alara came back with the bucket half full of eggs. She set it down by the porch steps and stood there, waiting for the next task. "Wood needs splitting," Rhett said, nodding toward the pile by the barn. "Axe is in the shed. Stack it by the house when you're done." She walked over, picked up the axe, and started swinging. The first few strikes were clumsy, glancing off the wood instead of splitting it clean. But she didn't stop, didn't complain, just adjusted her grip and kept going. Rhett worked his way down the fence line, and every time he glanced back, she was still at it. Sweat darkened her dress. Her arms had to be screaming, but she didn't quit. By midday, the pile of split wood had grown into something respectable. Rhett walked over and inspected it, then looked at her. Her face was flushed, hair stuck to her forehead, but her eyes were steady. "Good enough," he said. She nodded, breathing hard. "Lunch," Rhett said, and headed inside. They ate in silence again. Bread, cheese, cold meat from the smokehouse. Alara ate slower this time, more controlled, and Rhett figured her stomach was starting to remember how food worked. When they finished, he stood and grabbed his hat. "Cattle need moving to the north pasture," he said. "You're coming with me." She followed him out to the barn, where he saddled his horse, a big roan gelding named Dust, and gestured for her to climb up behind him. She hesitated, looking at the horse like it might bolt, but then grabbed his hand and pulled herself up. Her grip was strong, stronger than he expected. They rode out across the open land, the wind whipping at their clothes. The cattle were spread out near the creek, grazing lazy in the heat. Rhett circled around, nudging them north with whistles and shouts, and Alara held on tight, not saying a word. When one of the calves broke off and tried to run back, Rhett spurred Dust forward, cutting it off, and Alara leaned with him, instinctive, like she understood the rhythm of it. It took an hour to get them all through the gate and settled. By the time they rode back to the house, the sun was starting to drop, painting the sky rust and gold. Rhett swung down and offered his hand. Alara took it, slid off the horse, and landed hard, her legs buckling. She caught herself on the fence and stood there a moment, breathing through whatever hurt. "You'll feel it tomorrow," Rhett said. "I feel it now," she muttered. He almost smiled, almost. The days blurred together after that. Alara worked from dawn until dusk, doing whatever Rhett told her to do. She hauled water, scrubbed pots, mended shirts with needle and thread she found in a drawer. She learned to handle the chickens without getting pecked, to stack firewood so it wouldn't topple, to read the sky for rain that almost never came. Rhett didn't talk much. He wasn't the kind of man who filled silence with words, but he noticed things. Noticed the way she moved a little easier each day, how her hand stopped shaking when she held a cup. Noticed the bruises fading, new calluses forming where soft skin used to be. One evening, after supper, he found her sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the darkening hills. He sat down beside her, close enough that she could leave if she wanted, far enough that she didn't have to. "You don't ask questions," she said after a while. "Don't need to. Most people would." "I'm not most people." She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her face shifted. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. "I had a husband," she said quietly. "He died 2 years ago. Fever. After that, things fell apart. Lost the house. Lost everything. I had 2 boys. Couldn't feed them. Couldn't keep them. So I gave them to an orphanage in Billings and walked away." Rhett didn't say anything, just listened. "I kept thinking I'd go back when I had money," she continued, "when I had something to offer. But I never did. And the longer I waited, the harder it got to imagine showing up again. What would I even say?" "You'd say you came back," Rhett said. She shook her head. "It's not that simple." "It is." "You don't know that—" "I know you're here," Rhett said, cutting her off. "I know you didn't quit. That counts for something." Elara looked down at her hands, fingers laced tight together. "Maybe." They sat there a while longer, the wind picking up around them, carrying the smell of dust and grass and something distant that might have been rain. Finally, Rhett stood and went inside, leaving her alone with whatever thought she was wrestling. But later that night, lying in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. 2 boys. An orphanage in Billings. A mother who walked away because she didn't have a choice. He stared at the ceiling, jaw tight, and made a decision. 3 weeks passed. Elara grew stronger, sharper, more sure of herself. She stopped flinching when Rhett came up behind her, stopped looking at the horizon like she expected something bad to come walking out of it. She even laughed once when one of the chickens chased Rhett across the yard after he tried to steal an egg from under it. "Thought you said they don't peck," she called out, grinning. "They don't peck you," Rhett shot back, and she laughed again, and it was the best sound he'd heard in years. That night, after supper, Rhett poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. "We're going to Billings," he said. Elara froze, spoon halfway to her mouth. "What?" "Your boys. We're getting them." She set the spoon down, hands shaking again for the first time in weeks. "Rhett, I can't." "Yes, you can. I don't have money. I don't have a house. I don't have anything to—" "You have this," Rhett said, gesturing around the room. "You have work. You have a place. That's more than you had before." "It's not enough," she whispered. "It'll have to be." Elara stared at him, eyes bright and wet, and for a moment he thought she might argue. But then she just nodded, slow and shaky, and Rhett knew there was no going back now. "We leave in 2 days," he said. "Pack light." The journey to Billings took 4 days by wagon, rolling across endless stretches of dry land under a sky so wide it felt like drowning. Elara didn't talk much. She sat beside Rhett on the bench seat, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead like she was seeing something he couldn't. At night, they camped under the stars. Rhett built a fire, cooked beans and bacon, and they ate in silence. Once she asked him why he was doing this. "Because it's the right thing," he said. "That's not a reason. It's the only one I got." She didn't push, just pulled her blanket tighter and stared into the fire until her eyes drifted shut. On the 4th day, they reached Billings. The orphanage was a gray brick building on the edge of town, surrounded by a fence that needed paint. A woman in a dark dress answered the door, looked them over with sharp eyes, and asked what they wanted. "I'm here for my sons," Elara said, voice steady despite the way her hands were shaking. "Daniel and Thomas Quinn." The woman's expression didn't change. "And you are?" "Their mother." "I see." The woman glanced at Rhett. "And him?" Elara hesitated. Rhett stepped forward. "I'm with her," he said. The woman studied him a moment longer, then stepped aside. "Wait here." They stood in the narrow entryway, Elara gripping the edge of her shawl so tight her knuckles went white. Rhett didn't touch her, didn't say anything, just stood close enough that she knew he wasn't going anywhere. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Then two boys appeared, small and thin, with dark hair and eyes that looked too old for their faces. The younger one saw Alara and stopped dead. "Mama?" Alara's face crumpled. She dropped to her knees and opened her arms, and both boys ran to her, crashing into her so hard she almost fell over. She held them tight, sobbing into their hair, and Rhett turned away, jaw clenched. Something hot and sharp lodged in his chest. The woman cleared her throat. "Mrs. Quinn, we'll need to discuss if she's taking them," Rhett said, voice flat and hard. The woman frowned. "It's not that simple. There are procedures. We need to ensure she can provide—" "She can. And you are?" Rhett looked at Alara, still holding her boys, and something clicked into place. Something he hadn't planned but couldn't take back. "I'm her husband," he said. Alara's head snapped up, eyes wide. Rhett met her gaze and held it. "We have a ranch," he continued, turning back to the woman, "north of here. Cattle, land, a house. They'll have food, beds, work to keep them strong. That enough for you?" The woman's mouth thinned, but she nodded. "I'll need documentation." "You'll get it." An hour later, they walked out of the orphanage with Daniel and Thomas between them, each boy carrying a small bundle of clothes. Alara kept looking at Rhett like she didn't understand what had just happened. He didn't look back, just loaded the boys into the wagon, climbed up onto the bench, and started the long ride home. The boys didn't talk much on the way back. Daniel, the older one, sat stiff and watchful, eyes darting between Rhett and the horizon, like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Thomas, younger and smaller, leaned against Alara and fell asleep within the first hour. That night, camped by a dry creek bed, Rhett built a fire and cooked supper while Alara sat with the boys, murmuring to them in a voice too low for him to hear. When the food was ready, he handed out plates, and they ate in silence. "You really got a ranch?" Daniel asked eventually, looking at Rhett with suspicion. "Yeah." "With cattle?" "Yeah." "You know how to ride a horse?" "I do." Daniel chewed on that for a while. "Can you teach me?" Rhett glanced at Alara. She was watching him, something unreadable in her eyes. "Yeah," he said. "I can teach you." Thomas perked up. "Me too?" "You too." The boys looked at each other, then back at Rhett, and for the first time since leaving Billings, something in their faces softened. Later, after the boys were asleep, Alara walked over to where Rhett sat by the fire, arms resting on his knees. "You didn't have to say that," she said quietly. "Say what?" "That you're my husband." Rhett poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers flare. "Needed to." "Why?" "Because they weren't going to let you take them otherwise." She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "And now what?" "Now we go home." "Rhett, it doesn't have to mean anything," he said, still not looking at her. "Just words to get them out of there. That's all." Alara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What if I want it to mean something?" Rhett finally looked at her. Her face was lit by firelight, shadows carving out the lines of exhaustion and hope, and something fragile he didn't have a name for. "Then we'll figure it out," he said. She nodded, and they sat there together, watching the fire burn down to coals, while the boys slept and the stars wheeled overhead, and the world kept turning, indifferent and vast, and somehow, for the first time in a long time, not quite so empty. The ranch looked different when they rolled up 5 days later, dust rising behind the wagon wheels like a promise finally kept. Daniel sat up straighter, eyes scanning the barn, the house, the empty fields stretching out toward the mountains. Thomas clutched Alara's arm, half awake and wary, but his gaze followed his brother's, taking it all in. Rhett pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch and climbed down, joints stiff from days of sitting. He reached up to help Alara, but she was already handing Thomas down to him, then Daniel, before dropping to the ground herself. The boys stood close together, not quite touching her, but not straying far either. "This is it," Rhett said, gesturing toward the house. "Home." Daniel frowned. "It's small." "It's big enough," Rhett said. He grabbed their bundles from the wagon bed and nodded toward the door. "Come on." Inside, the house felt even smaller with 4 people crowded into the front room. Rhett set the bundles down and looked at Alara, who was looking at the boys, who were looking at everything like they weren't sure whether to be relieved or scared. "You two are in the back room," Rhett said, pointing down the hall. "Your mother's been staying there, but we'll move her things. There's one bed, You'll have to share. Where will Mama sleep? Thomas asked, voice small. Rhett hesitated. Alara spoke before he could answer. I'll figure it out, she said quickly. Don't worry about me. Daniel crossed his arms. And where do you sleep? Other room, Rhett said, down the hall. The boy's eyes narrowed slightly, like he was doing math in his head and didn't like the answer. But he didn't say anything else, just picked up his bundle and walked toward the back room, Thomas trailing behind him. When they were out of earshot, Alara turned to Rhett. I can sleep out here, on the floor. I don't need... You're not sleeping on the floor. Then where? Rhett rubbed the back of his neck, jaw tight. We'll work it out. Rhett, later, he said, and walked outside before she could argue. He spent the next hour unhitching the horse, checking the fences he'd left unfinished, doing anything that kept his hands busy and his mind from circling the same problem over and over. When he finally came back inside, Alara had soup heating on the stove and the boys were sitting at the table, quiet and watchful. They ate without talking much. Daniel kept glancing at Rhett like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Thomas just stared at his bowl, spooning soup into his mouth with mechanical precision, like he'd learned not to waste food and couldn't shake the habit. After supper, Rhett showed them how to wash up at the basin, where to dump the dirty water, how to bank the stove so it didn't go cold overnight. The boys followed instructions without complaint, but their eyes stayed guarded, and Rhett didn't push. He remembered what it felt like to be young and uncertain, waiting for the next blow to land. When it was time for bed, Alara tucked them in, murmuring something soft that Rhett couldn't hear from the hallway. He stood there a moment, then turned and went to his own room, closing the door behind him. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling. Footsteps in the hall, the creak of floorboards, then silence. A soft knock broke it. Rhett sat up. Yeah? The door opened a crack and Alara slipped inside, closing it behind her. She stood there in the dim light from the window, arms wrapped around herself. I can't sleep out there, she said quietly. Not with them in the back room and you in here. It doesn't make sense. So what do you want to do? She looked at the bed, then at him, then at the floor. I don't know. Rhett swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood. You take it. I'll sleep on the floor. No. Alara, no, she said again, firmer this time. You've done enough. I'm not taking your bed. They stood there, locked in a stalemate neither of them knew how to break. Finally, Rhett sighed. We're both too tired for this, he said. Bed's big enough for two if we keep to our sides. You stay on yours, I'll stay on mine. That work for you? She hesitated, then nodded. Okay. Rhett grabbed a spare blanket from the chest and laid it down the center of the bed like a line neither of them would cross. Alara climbed in on one side, fully dressed, and turned toward the wall. Rhett lay down on the other side, boots still on, and stared at the ceiling. The silence stretched out, heavy and strange. Then Alara spoke, so quiet he almost missed it. Thank you. For what? For not making this harder than it has to be. Rhett didn't answer, just closed his eyes and tried not to think about how close she was, how easy it would be to reach across that blanket and touch her shoulder, her hand, anything. But he didn't. He stayed on his side and she stayed on hers, and eventually exhaustion pulled them both under. Morning came too soon. Rhett woke to pale light creeping through the window and the smell of coffee already brewing. He sat up, groggy, and realized Alara was gone. He pulled on his boots and walked out to the kitchen, where she stood by the stove, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up. You're up early, he said. Couldn't sleep, she said without turning around. Figured I'd make myself useful. Rhett poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. Boys still asleep? For now. He nodded, sipping the coffee. It was strong, bitter, exactly how he liked it. We need to set some rules, he said after a minute. Alara glanced at him. What kind of rules? Work rules. Chores. Can't have them sitting around doing nothing. They need to pull their weight. They're children, Rhett. They're old enough to learn. She turned to face him fully, arms crossed. What are you saying? I'm saying they need structure, routine, jobs they can handle. Daniel's what, 9, 10? He can feed chickens, haul water, help with the horses. Thomas is younger, but he can still gather eggs, stack firewood, keeps them busy, keeps them out of trouble. Alara's jaw tightened. They just got here. They need time to adjust. They'll adjust faster if they have something to do. or they'll resent you for working them like hired hands. Rhett set his cup down, harder than he meant to. I'm not working them like anything. I'm teaching them how to survive. You want them soft? Fine, but don't expect me to coddle them. I'm not asking you to coddle them. I'm asking you to give them a chance to breathe. They stared at each other, the air between them sharp and tense. Then footsteps sounded in the hall, and both boys appeared in the doorway, Daniel in front, Thomas half hidden behind him. We heard yelling, Daniel said, voice flat. We weren't yelling, Alara said quickly. Just talking. Sounded like yelling, Rhett straightened. Your mother and I are figuring things out, that's all. Daniel didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Thomas peeked around his brother, eyes wide and uncertain. You two hungry? Alara asked, forcing her voice lighter. They nodded. She pulled out the pan and started frying eggs, and the boys sat at the table, silent and watchful. Rhett poured himself more coffee and stayed where he was, leaning against the counter, feeling the weight of their stares like stones. Breakfast was quiet. Afterward, Rhett stood and looked at the boys. Daniel, he said, you're coming with me. Got some things to show you. Daniel glanced at Alara, who nodded, then stood and followed Rhett outside. Thomas started to get up too, but Alara put a hand on his shoulder. You're staying with me, she said gently. We've got work to do here. Outside, the morning was cool, the sky pale and cloudless. Rhett walked toward the barn, Daniel a few steps behind, hands shoved in his pockets. You know anything about horses? Rhett asked. No. You're going to learn. Inside the barn, Dust stood in his stall, chewing hay, unbothered by the intrusion. Rhett opened the gate and gestured for Daniel to come closer. The boy hesitated, then stepped forward. This is Dust, Rhett said. He's temperamental, but he's not mean. You treat him right, he'll treat you right. You treat him wrong, he'll let you know. Daniel stared at the horse, eyes wide. How do I treat him right? Firm but gentle, no sudden moves, let him smell you first. Rhett took Daniel's hand and held it out, palm up. Dust lowered his head, nostrils flaring, breath warm against the boy's skin. Daniel tensed but didn't pull away. Good, Rhett said. Now talk to him. Let him know you're not a threat. What do I say? Doesn't matter. Just talk. Daniel cleared his throat. Hi, Dust. I'm Daniel. The horse snorted, flicking his ears, and Daniel almost smiled. Rhett handed him a brush. Start with his neck, long strokes. Don't press too hard. Daniel took the brush and began, awkward at first, then finding a rhythm. Dust stood still, eyes half closed, and Rhett watched the boy's shoulders relax, just a little. You ever had a horse before? Daniel asked after a while. My father did. Taught me the same way I'm teaching you. Where's your father now? Dead. Daniel looked up, brush pausing mid-stroke. Mine too. Rhett nodded. I know. They worked in silence after that. Daniel brushing while Rhett mucked out the stall, pitching soiled hay into a wheelbarrow. When they finished, Rhett showed him how to measure out feed, how to check the water trough, how to latch the gate so it didn't swing open. Tomorrow, you'll do this on your own, Rhett said. All of it? All of it. Daniel looked at the horse, then at Rhett. What if I mess up? Then you fix it. The boy didn't argue, just nodded, and they walked back to the house together, the sun climbing higher, the day stretching out ahead of them like unmarked territory. Inside, Alara and Thomas were kneading dough at the table, flour dusting their hands and the front of Thomas's shirt. The younger boy looked up when they came in, face smudged with white. We're making bread, he announced, almost shy. I can see that, Rhett said. Alara wiped her hands on a rag. How'd it go? Fine, Rhett said. He looked at Daniel. He did good. Daniel's face didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, just a fraction. Alara saw it too, and her expression softened. Lunch in an hour, she said. Thomas and I will have it ready. Rhett nodded and headed back outside, leaving them to their work. The rest of the day passed in a blur of chores, checking fences, hauling water, splitting wood. Daniel shadowed him for most of it, asking questions, watching how things were done, taking it all in with the seriousness of someone who understood that survival wasn't guaranteed. By the time evening rolled around, they were all exhausted. Supper was bread and stew, eaten in weary silence. Afterward, Alara cleaned up while Rhett sat on the porch, smoking a cigarette he'd rolled from the last of his tobacco. Daniel came out and sat beside him, not saying anything, just watching the sky turn purple and orange. "You think we'll stay here?" the boy asked eventually. "That's up to your mother." "What about you?" Rhett exhaled smoke, slow and steady. "I'm not going anywhere." Daniel nodded, like that was answer enough. They sat there until the stars came out, cold and bright and distant, and then Rhett sent him inside to bed. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, rough and uneven, but holding together. Daniel took to the work like he'd been born to it, throwing himself into every task Rhett gave him with a determination that reminded Rhett of Alara. Thomas was slower, more hesitant, but he learned too, how to gather eggs without breaking them, how to stack wood so it didn't fall, how to sweep the porch without missing the corners. Alara worked harder than all of them. She cooked, cleaned, mended clothes that were falling apart, tended the small vegetable patch behind the house that Rhett had started and abandoned months ago. At night, she collapsed into bed beside Rhett, both of them too tired to care about the blanket between them, and slept hard until dawn pulled them back up again. It wasn't easy. Daniel had nightmares sometimes, waking up shouting, and Alara would go to him, sitting on the edge of his bed until he fell back asleep. Thomas cried once, quiet and muffled, when he thought no one was listening, and Rhett pretended he didn't hear it because he didn't know what to say. There were arguments too, small ones mostly, about chores or meals or whose turn it was to haul water. But they worked through them or around them and kept moving. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after they'd arrived, Rhett was fixing the barn door when Daniel appeared beside him, holding a piece of rope. "Can you teach me to tie knots?" the boy asked. Rhett looked at the rope, then at Daniel. "What for?" "I don't know. Just seems like something I should know." Rhett took the rope and showed him a bowline, then a clove hitch, then a square knot. Daniel practiced each one, fingers fumbling at first, then getting faster, more confident. "Why'd you learn all of this?" Daniel asked. "My father taught me. Said a man who couldn't tie a knot wasn't worth much." "Was he right?" Rhett shrugged. "Hasn't proven him wrong yet." Daniel grinned, just a little, and Rhett felt something loosen in his chest. The boy was still guarded, still waiting for the other shoe to drop, but he was starting to trust. Slowly, carefully. But it was there. That night, after the boys were asleep, Alara and Rhett sat on the porch, watching the wind push clouds across the moon. "They're settling in," she said quietly. "Yeah. Daniel's different around you, less angry. He's still angry, but less." She turned to look at him. "You're good with them." Rhett didn't answer, didn't know how to. He'd never thought of himself as good with anyone, let alone children, but he couldn't deny that something was shifting, both in the boys and in himself. "What happens when winter comes?" Alara asked. "We survive it." "That's not a plan." "It's the only one I've got." She sighed, leaning back against the post. "We'll need more firewood, more food, warmer clothes for the boys." "I'll handle it." "Rhett!" "I said I'll handle it." She went quiet, and Rhett wondered if he'd been too sharp. But then she reached over and touched his hand, just briefly, and the sting of his own words faded. "Thank you," she said. "You keep saying that, but because I keep meaning it." They sat there until the cold drove them inside, and when they climbed into bed that night, the blanket between them stayed in place, but Rhett noticed it had shifted slightly to one side. Neither of them moved it back. The weeks turned into a month. The boys grew stronger, their faces filling out, color returning to their cheeks. Daniel learned to saddle Dust on his own, and Rhett let him ride sometimes, circling the house while Rhett watched from the porch. Thomas discovered a nest of barn cats and spent hours coaxing them out with scraps of food, naming each one something ridiculous: whiskers, boots, turnip. Alara's garden started producing small, stubborn vegetables that tasted better than anything Rhett had eaten in years. She made soup with them, bread to go alongside, and the four of them ate together every night, the silence gradually filling with conversation. Not much, but enough. One evening, Daniel asked Rhett about the scar on his forearm, a jagged line that ran from wrist to elbow. "Got kicked by a horse," Rhett said. "Dust?" "No, meaner one. Sold him after that." "Did it hurt?" "Like hell." Thomas looked up from his plate. "You're not supposed to say hell." "Who told you that?" "Mama." Alara shot Rhett a look, but her mouth twitched, almost a smile. Rhett shrugged. Your mama's right, he said. Don't say it. But you just did. I'm older. I've earned it. Daniel snorted, and Thomas giggled, and even Alara laughed, and for a moment the house felt less like a place they were surviving in, and more like a place they were living. But the good moments were always followed by harder ones. Daniel got into a fight with Thomas over something small, a toy, a chore. Rhett couldn't remember, and it escalated fast. Shouting turned to shoving, and before Rhett could step in, Daniel had Thomas pinned against the wall, face red and furious. Enough! Rhett barked, pulling Daniel back. The boy jerked away, breathing hard. He's always in the way, always whining. I'm sick of it. That's your brother, Alara said sharply. I didn't ask for a brother. I didn't ask for any of this. The words hung in the air, raw and ugly. Thomas's eyes filled with tears, and he ran down the hall, slamming the door behind him. Alara started to follow, but Rhett stopped her. Let him go, he said quietly. She turned on him. You don't get to tell me how to handle my children. I'm not. I'm telling you to let him cool off. And what about Daniel? Rhett looked at the boy who stood with his arms crossed, jaw set, daring anyone to come at him. Daniel and I are going outside, Rhett said. Rhett, now, he said, and walked toward the door. Daniel hesitated, then followed. They stood in the yard, the wind whipping around them, cold and sharp. Rhett didn't say anything for a long time, just let the silence stretch until Daniel couldn't take it anymore. What? The boy snapped. You done throwing your tantrum? I wasn't. Yeah, you were. Rhett turned to face him. You're mad, I get it. You didn't ask for this, none of us did. But you're here now, and so is your brother, and so is your mother. You think shoving Thomas around is going to change that? Daniel looked away. He doesn't understand. Understand what? What it was like, at the orphanage. He was too young. He doesn't remember how bad it was. So you remember for both of you. That what you want? The boy's face crumpled, just for a second, before he locked it down again. I don't know what I want. Rhett sighed and sat down on the porch steps. After a moment, Daniel sat beside him. When I was your age, Rhett said, my father used to beat me. Not all the time. Just when he was drunk, or when I messed up, or when he felt like it. I hated him for it, spent years hating him. Daniel looked at him, eyes wide. What happened? He died. And I realized hating him didn't change anything, didn't make me feel better, just made me tired. So what'd you do? Let it go. Not all at once. Little by little. Until it didn't weigh so much anymore. Daniel stared at his hands. I don't know how to do that. You will. Takes time. They sat there until the cold got too sharp, then went back inside. Thomas was asleep, Alara sitting beside his bed, stroking his hair. She looked up when they came in, eyes red. He okay? Rhett asked. He will be. Daniel walked to the doorway, standing there awkwardly. I'm sorry, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Alara stood and pulled him into a hug. He resisted at first, then leaned into her, and Rhett turned away, giving them space. That night, when he and Alara climbed into bed, she lay facing him instead of the wall. Thank you, she said again. For what this time? For knowing what to say to him. I didn't. I just told him the truth. That's more than most people do. Rhett didn't answer, just looked at her, close enough now that he could see the freckles across her nose, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes. The blanket between them had shifted again, almost gone now, and neither of them mentioned it. Rhett, she said softly. Yeah? What are we doing? He knew what she meant, knew she wasn't asking about the ranch or the boys or the chores. She was asking about them, about this strange, fragile thing they were building without a blueprint. I don't know, he said honestly. But I'm not sorry we're doing it. Her eyes searched his face, and then she nodded. Me neither. They lay there in the dark, not touching, but not far apart, and Rhett felt the weight of the day settle over him like a blanket. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel heavy, it just felt like life. The first snow came in November, early and mean, blanketing the ranch in white that looked clean until you walked through it and realized how cold it really was. Rhett woke before dawn to find frost on the inside of the window and Alara already up, stoking the fire in the stove. She didn't say anything when he came into the kitchen, just handed him coffee and went back to work. Daniel was the first one to notice the snow. He burst into the kitchen, eyes wide, Thomas right behind him. "It's everywhere," Daniel said, almost breathless. "It's winter," Rhett said, pulling on his coat. "Get used to it." "Can we go out in it?" "After chores." The boys groaned but didn't argue, and Rhett headed outside into the sharp, bitter cold. The snow was deeper than he'd expected, almost to his knees in places, and the wind cut through his coat like it wasn't even there. He made his way to the barn, boots crunching, breath coming out in white clouds. Inside, dust stamped and snorted, agitated by the storm. Rhett calmed him with a hand on his neck and started mucking out the stall, moving fast to keep warm. By the time Daniel showed up, Rhett's fingers were numb despite his gloves. "Here," Rhett said, handing him the pitchfork. "Finish this. I need to check the fence line." "In this weather?" "Cattle don't care about weather, neither do we." Daniel took the pitchfork without complaint, and Rhett headed back out into the snow. The fence line was a mess, posts buried, wire sagging under the weight of ice. He worked for 2 hours, clearing sections, tightening wire, hammering posts back into place. By the time he got back to the house, his hands were raw and his face felt like it might crack if he smiled. Alara met him at the door with a towel and a look that said she wanted to yell at him but was holding back. "You're frozen," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Sit down." She pushed him into a chair and started pulling off his gloves, rubbing his hands between hers to get the blood moving again. It hurt, sharp and stinging, but Rhett didn't pull away. "You can't do everything yourself," she said quietly. "Someone has to." "Then let Daniel help. Let me help. You're going to kill yourself trying to carry it all." Rhett looked at her, at the worry creasing her forehead, and something in him softened. "Okay. Okay? Okay. I'll let you help." She nodded, still rubbing his hands, and Rhett realized how close she was, how her hair had come loose from its tie, falling around her face. He wanted to reach up and tuck it back, but he didn't. Just sat there, letting her warm him up, feeling the ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. The snow kept falling for 3 days straight. By the time it stopped, the world outside was unrecognizable, white and silent and impossibly vast. The boys spent hours playing in it, building things that looked like snowmen but weren't quite right, throwing snowballs at each other until their hands were too cold to keep going. Rhett watched them from the porch, smoking a cigarette he'd traded for in town weeks ago. Alara came out and stood beside him, arms wrapped around herself. "They look happy," she said. "They are. You think it'll last?" "Nothing lasts forever." She glanced at him. "You always this cheerful?" "Pretty much." She almost smiled, and Rhett felt the corner of his mouth twitch in response. They stood there watching the boys until Thomas slipped and fell face first into a drift, coming up sputtering and laughing, and even Rhett couldn't help but grin. That night, the temperature dropped so low that the water in the basin froze solid. Rhett piled extra blankets on the boys' bed and made sure the fire stayed burning through the night. When he finally climbed into bed beside Alara, she was shivering despite the layers she wore. "Come here," he said without thinking. She hesitated, then moved closer, and Rhett wrapped an arm around her, pulling her against his chest. She stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, her head tucking under his chin. She was small and solid and warm, and Rhett closed his eyes, breathing in the smell of wood smoke and soap. "This okay?" he asked quietly. "Yeah," she whispered. "It's okay." They didn't talk after that, just lay there, holding each other against the cold. And when Rhett finally fell asleep, it was the best rest he'd had in years. Morning came gray and bitter. Rhett woke to find Alara already gone, the space beside him cold. He dressed quickly and went to the kitchen, where she was frying bacon and Daniel was setting the table. "Where's Thomas?" Rhett asked. "Still asleep?" Alara said. "He was up half the night coughing." Rhett frowned. "Coughing how?" "Bad. I gave him water, but it didn't help much." Rhett walked down the hall and opened the door to the boys' room. Thomas was curled up under the blankets, face flushed, breathing shallow and raspy. Rhett put a hand on his forehead and felt the heat radiating off him. "He's burning up," Rhett said, coming back to the kitchen. Alara's face went pale. "How bad?" "Bad enough." She set down the spatula and hurried to the room, Rhett right behind her. She pulled back the blankets and touched Thomas's face, his neck, his chest, and her hands were shaking. "We need to get him cooled down," she said, voice tight. "I'll get water," Rhett said, and went outside to break the ice on the water barrel. He filled a basin and brought it inside, and Alara soaked a cloth, pressing it to Thomas's forehead. The boy stirred, whimpering, but didn't wake. "He needs medicine," Alara said. "Something for the fever." "Closest town's 10 miles. Roads are buried." "Then we dig them out." Rhett looked at the window, at the snow still piled high against the glass, and knew she was right. "I'll hitch the wagon." "I'm coming with you." "Alara saw, I'm coming." He didn't argue, just nodded and went to get Dust ready. By the time they left, Daniel was sitting beside Thomas, holding his brother's hand and looking scared in a way that made Rhett's chest ache. "Stay with him," Rhett told the boy. "Keep the fire going. We'll be back soon." Daniel nodded, and Rhett and Alara climbed onto the wagon, wrapped in every blanket they could find. The journey was brutal. The snow was deep, the wagon wheels sinking and sticking, and Dust fought every step. Rhett had to get down twice to clear the path, shoveling with his hands when the shovel broke. And by the time they reached town, his lungs burned and his legs felt like lead. The doctor's office was a small building near the edge of town, smoke rising from the chimney. Rhett pounded on the door until a man opened it, gray-haired and irritated. "What?" the man snapped. "Need medicine," Rhett said. "Boy's got a fever, bad one." The doctor looked them over, then sighed. "Come in." Inside, the office smelled like antiseptic and old paper. The doctor rummaged through a cabinet and pulled out a small bottle. "Willow bark extract," he said. "Teaspoon every 4 hours. Keep him warm, keep him hydrated. If the fever doesn't break in 2 days, bring him here." "How much?" Rhett asked. $2. Rhett pulled out the money, hands still numb from the cold, and the doctor handed over the bottle. "Good luck," he said, not unkindly. The ride back was worse than the ride there. The wind picked up, howling across the open land, and Alara huddled against Rhett, shaking so hard he could feel it through both their coats. When they finally reached the ranch, Rhett practically carried her inside, and Daniel jumped up from where he'd been sitting by Thomas's bed. "Is he okay?" the boy asked, voice cracking. "He will be," Alara said, though her voice shook. She poured a spoonful of the medicine and coaxed Thomas awake enough to swallow it. The boy coughed, sputtered, but got it down, and Alara smoothed his hair back, murmuring soft reassurances. Rhett built up the fire until the room was almost too warm, then sat down in the chair by the bed, not planning to move until Thomas was better. "You should rest," Alara said. "I'm fine." "Rhett, I'm not leaving." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and sat down beside him. Daniel curled up on the floor near the bed, refusing to go to his own room, and the three of them kept watch through the night. Thomas's fever broke just before dawn. One moment he was burning up, the next his skin was cool and damp, and he opened his eyes, blinking in the firelight. "Mama?" he whispered. Alara was beside him in an instant, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." Thomas looked past her to Rhett. "Did I get sick?" "Yeah," Rhett said, his voice rougher than he intended. "But you're okay now." The boy smiled, small and tired, and closed his eyes again, drifting back into a real sleep this time, not the feverish half-consciousness he'd been trapped in. Alara sagged forward, forehead pressed to the mattress, and Rhett put a hand on her shoulder. "He's okay," Rhett said quietly. "You did good." She looked up at him, eyes red and exhausted. "We did good." Rhett didn't argue, just squeezed her shoulder and stood, stretching the stiffness out of his back. Daniel was still asleep on the floor, and Rhett picked him up carefully, carrying him to the other bed. The boy didn't wake, just curled into the blankets, and Rhett pulled them up around him before heading back to the kitchen. Alara followed a few minutes later, and they sat at the table in silence, too tired to talk. Finally, she reached across and took his hand. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to keep thanking me." "Yes, I do." Rhett looked at their hands, her fingers small and rough against his, and felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't name but couldn't ignore either. "Alara," he said quietly. "Yeah? I'm glad you're here." Her eyes filled with tears again, but she smiled. I'm glad I'm here too. Thomas recovered slowly over the next week, gaining strength little by little until he was back to his usual self, pestering Daniel and playing with the barn cats and eating like he was making up for lost time. The snow started to melt, turning the ground into thick mud that sucked at their boots and made every step twice as hard. One afternoon, Rhett was in the barn repairing a broken harness when Daniel appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. Can I ask you something? The boy said. Sure. Are you and Mama... are you... He trailed off, face red. Rhett set down the harness. What are you trying to ask? Are you really married? The question hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable. Rhett had known it was coming eventually, but that didn't make it easier to answer. Legally? Rhett said carefully. No. Daniel frowned. Then why'd you tell them you were? At the orphanage? Because they wouldn't have let her take you otherwise. So you lied. Yeah, I lied. The boy crossed his arms, jaw tight. What happens when they find out? They won't. But what if they do? Rhett stood and walked over to him, looking him square in the eye. Then I'll deal with it. But you and your brother aren't going back there. Not ever. You understand? Daniel searched his face, then nodded slowly. Okay. Anything else you want to ask? The boy hesitated. Do you love her? Rhett felt the air go out of his lungs. He didn't know how to answer that, didn't even know if he knew the answer himself. What he felt for Alara was tangled and complicated, something that had grown slowly without him noticing until it was too big to ignore. I care about her, Rhett said finally, and I care about you and your brother. That's the truth. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded again. That's good enough. He turned and walked out, and Rhett stood there alone, the question still echoing in his head. Did he love her? Maybe. Probably. But saying it out loud felt like stepping off a cliff, and Rhett wasn't sure he was ready for that yet. That night, after the boys were asleep, Alara found him on the porch, staring out at the dark. Daniel asked me something today, Rhett said without looking at her. What? If I loved you, he heard her breath catch. What'd you tell him? That I cared about you, about all of you. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, And is that true? Rhett turned to face her. Yeah, it's true. Alara stepped closer, close enough that he could see the way the moonlight caught in her eyes. I care about you too, she said softly. More than I thought I would. More than I probably should. Why shouldn't you? Because this wasn't supposed to be real. It was supposed to be temporary, a way to get my boys back. But now, she trailed off, shaking her head. Now it feels real. It is real, Rhett said. Has been for a while. She looked up at him, searching his face, and then she reached up and touched his cheek, her hand cold against his skin. Rhett covered her hand with his, holding it there, and for a moment neither of them moved. What do we do now? She whispered. We keep going, Rhett said, same as we've been doing. And if it gets harder, then we figure it out. She nodded, and Rhett pulled her into his arms, holding her the way he had that cold night weeks ago. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, and Rhett closed his eyes, breathing her in. I'm not going anywhere, he said quietly. Promise? Promise. They stood there until the cold drove them inside, and when they climbed into bed that night, the blanket between them was gone. Alara curled into his side, her hand resting on his chest, and Rhett wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. Rhett? She murmured, half asleep. Yeah? Thank you for saving us. You saved yourselves, he said. I just gave you a place to land. She didn't answer, already asleep, and Rhett lay there in the dark, feeling the weight of her against him, the steady rhythm of her breathing. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone, and that scared him more than anything. Winter dragged on, brutal and unforgiving. The snow came and went in waves, each storm worse than the last, and Rhett worked himself half to death keeping the ranch running. The boys helped where they could, and Alara kept the house warm and the meals coming, but there were days when it felt like they were barely holding on. One particularly bad night, a pipe burst in the barn, flooding the stalls and soaking through the hay. Rhett spent hours in the freezing water trying to patch it, and by the time he came inside, he was shaking so hard he could barely stand. Alara took one look at him and ordered him into the tub. She heated water on the stove, pouring it over him while he sat there, teeth chattering, too tired to argue. When he was finally warm enough to move, she wrapped him in blankets and made him sit by the fire with a cup of something hot that burned going down. "You're going to kill yourself," she said, not for the first time. "Not yet," Rhett said. "I'm serious, Rhett. You can't keep doing this." "What else am I supposed to do?" "Ask for help. Let people in. Stop acting like you have to carry everything alone." Rhett looked at her, at the frustration and fear in her eyes, and realized she was right. He'd spent so long doing everything himself that he'd forgotten how to let anyone else share the load. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay? I'll try." She sat down beside him, and they stared into the fire together, not talking, just being. And for the first time in weeks, Rhett felt like maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it. Spring came slowly, reluctant, the snow melting in patches to reveal dead grass and mud underneath. The air warmed just enough to make breathing easier, and the boys spent more time outside, chasing each other around the yard and climbing on the fence rails. One morning, Rhett woke to find Alara gone from the bed. He got up and found her in the garden, digging in the soft earth, planting seeds she'd saved from last year. "It's too early," Rhett said, leaning against the fence. "It's never too early to hope," she said without looking up. Rhett watched her work, the way her hands moved through the dirt, careful and deliberate, and felt something warm settle in his chest. She was building something here, same as he was. Not just surviving, but planting roots, making a future. "Need help?" he asked. She looked up, surprised, then smiled. "Yeah, I do." He grabbed a shovel and started turning the soil, and they worked side by side until the sun climbed high and the boys came running out to see what they were doing. Daniel grabbed a rake, Thomas a bucket, and together they planted rows of seeds: carrots, beans, potatoes, squash. "Will they grow?" Thomas asked, peering into the bucket. "If we take care of them," Alara said. "What if we don't?" "Then they won't." The boy thought about that, then nodded seriously and went back to work. Rhett caught Alara's eye, and she smiled at him, soft and real, and Rhett felt the future stretching out ahead of them, uncertain but possible. That night, after the boys were asleep, Rhett and Alara sat on the porch, watching the stars come out one by one. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. "Sometimes." "What do you think about?" Rhett was quiet for a moment. "I think about the boys growing up here, learning to work the land, maybe taking over someday. And us?" He looked at her. "What about us? Where do we fit in all that?" Rhett reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Right here, same as we've been." She squeezed his hand, and they sat there in the quiet, holding on to each other and the fragile, imperfect life they were building together. It wasn't easy, it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. The seeds sprouted 2 weeks later, tiny green shoots pushing up through the dark soil like promises being kept. Thomas checked them every morning, crouching in the dirt to count how many had come up, reporting back to Alara with the seriousness of someone entrusted with something important. Daniel pretended not to care, but Rhett caught him looking more than once, and there was something soft in the boy's face when he did. Spring turned the land green, slow and tentative at first, then all at once, like the earth had been holding its breath and finally let go. The creek ran high with snowmelt, the cattle grew fat on new grass, and the days stretched longer, warmer, full of light that felt like it might never end. Rhett worked from dawn until dark, repairing what winter had broken, reinforcing what it had weakened. Daniel shadowed him most days, learning without being taught, picking things up just by watching. The boy had grown taller over the winter, his shoulders broader, his hands rougher. He looked less like a child now, and more like someone trying to figure out what kind of man he wanted to be. One afternoon, Rhett was replacing a section of roof on the barn when Daniel climbed up the ladder and sat beside him, dangling his legs over the edge. "You ever think about leaving?" the boy asked. Rhett hammered in a nail before answering. "Leaving where?" "Here. The ranch. Montana. All of it." "No." "Why not?" Rhett looked at him. "Where would I go?" Daniel shrugged. "I don't know. Somewhere easier, somewhere that doesn't try to kill you every winter." "Easier doesn't mean better." Maybe not, but it might mean happier. Rhett set down the hammer and leaned back, looking out at the land stretching toward the mountains. You thinking about leaving? I don't know. Sometimes I wonder what else is out there, if there's something more than this. There is, Rhett said, but more doesn't always mean good. Sometimes it just means different. Daniel was quiet for a moment, picking at a splinter in the wood. You ever regret it, staying here instead of going somewhere else? No. Not even a little? Rhett thought about that. Thought about the years he'd spent alone, working a piece of land that barely gave back what he put into it, wondering if he was wasting his life. But then he thought about Alara, about the boys, about the way the house felt now, lived in, full, real. No, he said again, and meant it. Daniel nodded slowly like he'd gotten the answer he needed, and they went back to work without saying anything else. But Rhett noticed the boys stayed close the rest of the day, working a little harder, complaining a little less, and he wondered what was going through Daniel's head that he wasn't saying out loud. That night, Alara asked Rhett if he'd noticed anything different about Daniel. Like what? Rhett said, pulling off his boots. I don't know. He's been quiet, more than usual. He's always quiet. This is different. Rhett looked at her. He asked me today if I ever thought about leaving. Her face went still. What did you tell him? That I didn't. That I'm staying. And what did he say? Nothing. Just went back to work. Alara sat down on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap. He's scared. Of what? That this won't last, that we'll lose it somehow, that he'll have to leave again. Rhett sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. He's not leaving. None of you are. You can't promise that. Yes, I can. She turned to look at him, eyes searching his face. What if something happens to you? What if you get hurt, or sick, or... I won't. You don't know that. Alara, I'm serious, Rhett. We're not legal. We're not really married. If something happens to you, what happens to us? To the boys? Do we just get kicked off the land? Do they go back to the orphanage? Rhett's jaw tightened. He hadn't thought about that, or maybe he had and just pushed it aside because it was easier not to deal with. But she was right. As things stood, they had no claim to anything, no protection, no guarantee. Then we fix it, he said. How? We get married. For real this time. Alara stared at him, mouth slightly open, like she couldn't tell if he was serious. What? You heard me. Rhett, you can't just... Why not? We're already living like we're married, already raising the boys together. What's the difference? The difference is you're talking about making it permanent. It already is permanent, Rhett said. Has been for a while. This just makes it legal. She looked down at her hands and Rhett saw her fingers trembling. You don't have to do this. I know. Then why are you? Because I want to. The words hung in the air between them, simple and true, and Rhett realized as he said them that he meant it. Not because he had to, not because it was the right thing to do, but because he wanted Alara beside him, wanted the boys in his house, wanted this messy, complicated life they'd built together. Alara, he said quietly, marry me. She looked up, tears streaming down her face, and nodded. Okay. Okay? Yes. Okay. I'll marry you. Rhett pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, and felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked up for years. She clung to him, shaking, and he pressed his face into her hair, breathing her in. We'll go to town tomorrow, he said. Get it done proper. What about the boys? They come with us. She pulled back, wiping her eyes. You think they'll be happy about it? I think they'll be relieved. He was right. When they told the boys the next morning, Daniel's whole face changed, the tension that had been there for weeks melting away. Really? The boy asked, looking between them. Really? Rhett said. Thomas grinned, wide and bright. Does that mean you're our father now? Rhett hesitated, glancing at Alara. She nodded, eyes wet again, and Rhett looked back at Thomas. Yeah, he said, voice rough. I guess it does. Thomas threw his arms around Rhett's waist, squeezing hard, and Daniel came over too, more hesitant, but when Rhett put a hand on his shoulder, the boy leaned into it. Alara watched them, crying openly now, and Rhett felt the weight of it all settle over him, the responsibility, the fear, the love he hadn't asked for but couldn't imagine living without. They rode into town that afternoon. All four of them crowded onto the wagon bench. It was a warm day, the sky clear and blue, and the boys were restless, excited in a way they hadn't been before. When they reached the courthouse, a small brick building in the center of town, Rhett tied up the horse and they all went inside. The clerk was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and ink stains on his fingers. He looked them over with mild curiosity and asked what they needed. "Marriage license," Rhett said. The clerk pulled out a form and started writing. Names: Rhett Calloway, Alara Quinn. Date of birth? They answered the questions one by one, and when the clerk asked if they had witnesses, Rhett nodded toward the boys. The clerk raised an eyebrow but didn't comment, just made a note and slid the paper across the desk. "Sign here," he said. "Both of you." Rhett signed first, then handed the pen to Alara. Her hand shook as she wrote her name, and when she finished, she looked at Rhett like she couldn't quite believe it was real. "That's it?" she asked. "That's it," the clerk said. "You're married. Congratulations." They walked out into the sunlight, and Thomas looked up at Rhett. "Are we a family now?" "Yeah," Rhett said, ruffling the boy's hair. "We're a family." Daniel didn't say anything, but when they climbed back onto the wagon, he sat a little closer to Rhett, and that was enough. The ride home was quiet, but it was a good quiet, the kind that didn't need filling. When they pulled up to the house, Alara turned to Rhett and smiled, and he felt something shift inside him, something that had been jagged and sharp smoothing out into something softer. That night, after the boys were asleep, Rhett and Alara lay in bed, not touching but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her beside him. "You scared?" she asked. "Of what?" "This. Us. All of it." Rhett thought about lying but decided against it. "Yeah. A little. Me too." He reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "We'll figure it out." "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." She turned onto her side, facing him, and Rhett did the same. In the darkness, he could barely make out her features, but he didn't need to see her to know what she looked like. He'd memorized every line, every freckle, every expression. "I love you," she said quietly. The words hit him like a punch, unexpected and overwhelming. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Alara smiled, sad and understanding. "You don't have to say it back," she said. "I just wanted you to know." Rhett swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I'm not good at this." "I know. I don't know how to—" "Rhett," she said, putting a hand on his cheek. "It's okay. I know." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, and felt the weight of everything he couldn't say pressing down on him. But maybe she was right. Maybe she already knew. The days that followed were easier, lighter, like something had been lifted that none of them had realized they were carrying. The boys settled in deeper, their laughter coming more freely, their smiles less guarded. Daniel started calling Rhett by his name instead of just you or him, and Thomas began every sentence with Papa, like he was testing it out, seeing how it fit. Alara bloomed in a way Rhett hadn't seen before. She sang while she worked, hummed while she cooked, smiled at nothing and everything. One morning, Rhett caught her dancing in the kitchen, spinning in a slow circle with her eyes closed, and he stood in the doorway just watching until she noticed him and laughed, embarrassed. "Don't stop," he said. "I'm being ridiculous." "No, you're happy." She walked over and took his hands, pulling him into the middle of the room. "Dance with me." "I don't dance." "Yes, you do. You just don't know it yet." She moved his hands to her waist and started swaying, and Rhett followed awkwardly, stepping on her feet twice before he found the rhythm. They moved together in the small kitchen, no music but the sound of their breathing, and Rhett realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this light. "See?" Alara said, grinning up at him. "You're dancing." "Barely. It counts." He pulled her closer, resting his chin on top of her head, and they swayed like that until the bread in the oven started to burn and Alara had to pull away, laughing. But the good days didn't erase the hard ones. There were still moments when Daniel pulled away, retreating into himself, his face closing off in a way that reminded Rhett of how he used to be. There were still nights when Thomas woke up crying, calling for a father who wasn't coming back. And there were still times when Rhett looked at the land, at the work that never ended, and felt the weight of it all threatening to crush him. One evening, a man rode up to the ranch just as the sun was setting. He was older, gray-haired, with a face weathered by years of wind and sun. He dismounted slowly, like his joints hurt, and walked up to where Rhett stood on the porch. "Help you?" Rhett asked, not unfriendly but not welcoming either. "Name's Porter," the man said. "I own the land to the east. Came to talk business." Rhett crossed his arms. "What kind of business?" "Heard you got married. Got a family now." "News travels fast." "It does." Porter looked past him toward the house, where Alara was visible through the window, setting the table. "I also heard you're running this place by yourself. No hired hands, no help." "I manage." "Barely." Porter's eyes were sharp, assessing. "I'm not here to insult you, Calloway. I'm here to make an offer." "Not interested in selling." "I'm not buying. I'm offering partnership. You work my land, I work yours. We pool resources, share labor during harvest, help each other through the hard times. It's how people survive out here." Rhett studied him, looking for the catch. "What do you get out of it?" "Same thing you do. Help when I need it. Security. A neighbor I can count on." "And if I say no," Porter shrugged, "then you say no. But winter's coming again, and you know as well as I do that doing it alone damn near killed you last time." Rhett's jaw tightened. The man wasn't wrong. Winter had been brutal, and if it hadn't been for Alara and the boys, Rhett wasn't sure he would have made it through. "I'll think about it," Rhett said. "Fair enough." Porter handed him a piece of paper with an address. "You decide you want to talk, come find me." He mounted his horse and rode off, and Rhett stood there watching until he disappeared over the hill. When he turned around, Alara was standing in the doorway. "What did he want?" she asked. "Partnership. He wants to pool resources, share work." "What did you tell him?" "That I'd think about it." She stepped closer. "And are you thinking about it?" "I don't know. I don't like depending on people." "It's not depending. It's cooperating." "Same thing." "No, it's not." She put a hand on his arm. "Rhett, you can't do everything by yourself. You said you'd try to let people help. This is someone offering to help. And what if he turns on us? What if he decides he wants more than partnership? Then we deal with it, but you can't live your whole life assuming the worst of everyone." Rhett looked down at her, at the earnestness in her face, and felt his resistance crumbling. "I'll talk to him," he said finally, "but I'm not promising anything." "That's all I'm asking." The next week, Rhett rode over to Porter's land. It was bigger than his, with more cattle, a larger house, and 2 hired men working the fields. Porter greeted him at the door and invited him in, and they spent 2 hours going over details, laying out terms, figuring out how it would work. By the time Rhett left, they had an agreement. They'd help each other during planting and harvest, share equipment when needed, and keep an eye on each other's land when one of them was away. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was something, a foundation. When Rhett got home, Alara was waiting on the porch. "Well?" she asked. "We have a deal." She smiled, bright and relieved. "Good. Don't say I told you so." "I wasn't going to." "You were thinking it." "Maybe a little." Rhett shook his head, but he was smiling too. And when she came over and kissed him, quick and light, he didn't pull away. Summer came in full force, hot and dry, the sun beating down relentlessly. The garden flourished under Alara's care, and they had more vegetables than they knew what to do with. She canned what they couldn't eat, lining the shelves with jars of tomatoes, beans, pickles, preserving the abundance for the lean times ahead. The boys thrived too. Daniel grew another inch, his voice dropping lower, cracking sometimes when he spoke. He started shaving, badly at first, nicking himself until Rhett showed him how to do it properly. Thomas learned to ride, not well, but well enough that Rhett let him take one of the older horses out by himself sometimes, and the pride on the boy's face the first time he came back alone was something Rhett knew he'd never forget. One evening, Rhett and Daniel were mending a fence when the boy spoke up. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. "Go ahead." "Do you ever think about your father?" Rhett paused, hammer in hand. "Sometimes." "Do you miss him?" "No." Daniel looked at him, surprised. "Why not?" "Because he wasn't a good man, and missing someone who hurt you doesn't make sense. Even if they're your father. Especially then." The boy was quiet for a moment, working the wire through the post. "I miss mine,"
he said finally. Even though he died and left us, even though everything went bad after, I still miss him. That's different, Rhett said. Your father didn't choose to leave. Mine did every day by being the kind of man he was. You think I'll be like him? My father? Which parts? Daniel shrugged. The good parts, I guess.
Rhett set down the hammer and looked at the boy, really looked at him. You're already like him, Daniel. You take care of your brother. You work hard. You don't quit. Those are the good parts. That's what matters. The boy's face softened just a little. You think so? I know so. Daniel nodded, and they went back to work, but Rhett noticed the boy stood a little taller after that, moved a little easier like he'd been carrying something heavy, and finally set it down. That night, lying in bed beside Alara, Rhett told her about the conversation. He's a good kid, Rhett said. He is. Because of you. Not just me. Mostly you. She turned to face him. You know what you are to them, don't you? What? Everything. You're everything to them. Rhett felt his throat tighten. I'm just trying not to mess it up. You're not. You're doing it right. He wanted to believe her, but doubt still crept in sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep. What if he wasn't enough? What if he failed them? What if he turned out to be just like his father after all? But then Alara would reach for him in the dark, her hand finding his, and the doubt would fade, replaced by something steadier, something that felt like hope. Fall came fast, the air turning crisp, the leaves on the few trees around the house turning gold and red. They harvested what they could from the garden, and Porter came over with his men to help, just like he'd promised. They worked together for 3 days, filling wagons with hay, bundling feed, preparing for winter. On the last day, Porter stayed for supper, and Alara cooked a feast: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, pie made from the last of the summer berries. They sat around the table, all of them, talking and laughing, and Rhett realized this was what family felt like. Not just blood, but choice. People who showed up, people who stayed. After Porter left, the boys went to bed, and Rhett and Alara cleaned up in comfortable silence. Today was good, she said. It was. You looked happy. Rhett dried a plate, considering. I was. She turned to him, smiling. You should be happy more often. It suits you. He set down the plate and pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist. You make it easy. Do I? Yeah, you do. She kissed him, slow and soft, and Rhett felt the last of his walls crumble, the fear and doubt and loneliness that had defined him for so long finally giving way to something better, something real. When they pulled apart, Alara rested her forehead against his. I love you, Rhett Calloway. And this time Rhett didn't hesitate. I love you too. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and precious, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Alara smiled, wide and tearful, and kissed him again, and Rhett held her like he'd never let go. The seasons turned after that, one bleeding into the next, and the rhythm of their life took on a steadiness that felt almost like peace. Winter came again, but this time they were ready. The woodpile was twice as high, the pantry stocked with jars of food, the barn reinforced against the wind. When the snow fell, it didn't feel like a threat. It just felt like winter. Daniel turned 11 that year, tall and lean, his face losing the softness of childhood. He worked alongside Rhett without being asked, anticipating what needed doing before it was said. Thomas was 9, still small for his age, but scrappy, with a laugh that came easier now and a confidence that hadn't been there before. They fought sometimes, the way brothers do, but they looked out for each other too, and that mattered more. One morning in late January, Rhett woke to the sound of voices outside. He pulled on his clothes and went to the window, looking out to see Daniel and Thomas building something in the snow. It took him a moment to realize it was a fence, miniature and crooked, made from sticks they'd gathered. What are you doing? Rhett called from the porch. Building a corral, Daniel called back, for when we get more horses. Who said we're getting more horses? You did. Last week. You said if we had the money, we'd get another one for Thomas. Rhett had said that, though he didn't think the boy had been paying attention. And you're building a corral now? In the snow? Practicing, Daniel said, like it was obvious. Rhett shook his head, but he was smiling. Carry on, then. He went back inside where Alara was making breakfast, her hair tied back and flour dusting her hands. "They're building a corral," Rhett said. "I know. I told them they were crazy, but they didn't listen. Wonder where they get that from." She shot him a look, but she was smiling too. "You want coffee?" "Always." They ate together, the four of them, and the conversation flowed easy now, full of small jokes and plans for the day. It was ordinary, unremarkable, and Rhett realized that was exactly what made it perfect. This was what he'd been fighting for without knowing it. Not grand gestures or big moments, but the quiet, steady accumulation of days that added up to a life. After breakfast, Rhett and Daniel rode out to check the cattle. The herd had grown over the past year thanks to smart breeding and a partnership with Porter that had given them access to better stock. Rhett had plans to expand further, maybe buy the land to the west if it ever came up for sale, but for now, what they had was enough. "You think we'll always live here?" Daniel asked as they rode. "You planning on leaving?" "No, just wondering." Rhett looked at the boy, at the way he sat easy in the saddle now, comfortable in a way he hadn't been a year ago. "You can leave if you want, when you're older. Go see what's out there." "And if I don't want to?" "Then you stay, build your own life here." Daniel nodded, chewing on that. "You think Mama's happy?" "I know she is. Why?" "I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if she wishes things were different, if she misses how it used to be before everything went bad." Rhett pulled Dust to a stop and turned to face Daniel. "Your mother's been through hell. Lost your father, lost her home, had to give you and your brother up because she didn't have a choice. You think she'd trade what she has now to go back to that?" "No, but maybe she misses the parts that were good before it all fell apart." "Probably," Rhett said, "but missing something doesn't mean you want it back. It just means it mattered." Daniel looked at him, something uncertain flickering in his eyes. "You think she'd have been happier if she'd never met you? If she'd figured it out some other way?" The question hit Rhett harder than he expected. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe, but I'm glad she didn't." "Me too," Daniel said quietly, and they rode on in silence. That night, Rhett told Alara about the conversation. "He's worried about you," Rhett said, lying beside her in the dark. "I know. He always has been." She turned toward him, her face barely visible in the moonlight. "But he doesn't need to be. Not anymore." "You sure about that?" "Yes." She reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle. "I'm happy, Rhett. Happier than I've been in years. Maybe ever. Even with all this? The work, the cold, the uncertainty? Especially with all this. Because it's real. It's ours." Rhett covered her hand with his, holding it against his cheek. "I never thought I'd have this." "Have what?" "A family. People who stayed." "We're not going anywhere," she said. "None of us." He believed her, and that was the most remarkable thing. After a lifetime of expecting the worst, of waiting for things to fall apart, he finally believed that something good could last. Spring brought new challenges. One of the older cows got sick, and despite everything Rhett tried, she didn't make it. He buried her out beyond the fence line and came back to the house exhausted and frustrated, hating that he'd failed. Alara found him on the porch, sitting with his head in his hands. "I did everything right," he said, "and she still died." "I know." "So what's the point?" Alara sat beside him. "The point is you tried. That's all you can do." "It's not enough." "It never is, but you keep trying anyway." Rhett looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, and felt some of the frustration ease. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Stay calm when everything's falling apart." "I'm not calm. I'm just better at hiding it." She leaned against him, shoulder to shoulder. "We've lost so much already, Rhett. One cow isn't going to break us." "What if it's not just one cow? What if it's the beginning of something worse? Then we deal with it, like we always do." He wanted to argue, to point out all the ways things could go wrong, but he didn't. Just sat there beside her, letting her presence anchor him, and eventually the fear loosened its grip. Summer was better. The garden exploded with life, more than they could eat or preserve, so Alara started trading with other families in town. She'd load up the wagon with vegetables and come back with flour, sugar, fabric for new clothes. The boys went with her sometimes, and they'd come home talking about the people they'd met, the things they'd seen, slowly building connections beyond the ranch. One evening, Thomas came running into the house, breathless and excited. "There's a traveling show coming to town," he said. "Can we go, please?" Rhett looked at Alara, who shrugged. "When?" "Saturday. They've got singers and dancers and a man who can juggle fire." "Fire?" Rhett raised an eyebrow. "That's what the poster said." Daniel appeared in the doorway. "I want to go too." Rhett sighed, knowing he was outnumbered. "Fine, but we're not staying all night." Saturday came bright and warm, and they rode into town together, the boys bouncing with anticipation. The show was set up in a field at the edge of town, a makeshift stage and rows of benches already filling with people. Rhett paid for tickets, and they found seats near the back, Thomas squirming with excitement, Daniel trying to look unimpressed, but failing. The show started with music, a fiddler and a man on a battered piano, playing songs Rhett half remembered from his childhood. Then came the dancers, women in bright dresses spinning and kicking, and the boys watched wide-eyed. The fire juggler came last, and even Rhett had to admit it was impressive. 5 torches spinning through the air, flames trailing behind them like ribbons. When it was over, they walked back through town, the boys chattering about what they'd seen. Rhett noticed Alara was quiet, and when he caught her eye, she was smiling. "What?" he asked. "Nothing, just, this is nice." "The show?" "All of it. Being out here, being together, feeling normal." Rhett took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "We are normal." "Are we?" "Close enough." She laughed, and the sound made something warm bloom in Rhett's chest. They walked like that, hand in hand, the boys running ahead, and for a moment Rhett let himself feel it. The completeness, the rightness of it all. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. A few weeks later, a stranger rode up to the ranch. He was young, clean-shaven, wearing clothes that marked him as someone from back east. He dismounted and walked up to the porch where Rhett was sitting, repairing a saddle. "Help you?" Rhett asked. "I'm looking for Alara Quinn," the man said. Rhett's hand stilled. "Why?" "I'm a representative from the Billings orphanage. We've had some questions raised about the legitimacy of Mrs. Quinn's marriage and her custody of the children." Rhett stood slowly, setting the saddle aside. "Who raised these questions?" "That's confidential." "Like hell it is." The man's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to verify some information. Is Mrs. Quinn available?" "It's Calloway now," Rhett said. "And yeah, she's available." He called for Alara, and she came out wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw the stranger, her face went pale. "What's this about?" she asked. "Mrs. Calloway," the man said, nodding politely. "I'm here on behalf of the orphanage. We received a letter claiming that your marriage to Mr. Calloway may have been fraudulent, entered into solely for the purpose of reclaiming your children." Alara's breath caught. "Who sent the letter?" "I can't disclose that, but I need to verify the legitimacy of your marriage." Rhett stepped forward. "We got married legal, got the papers to prove it." "I understand, but the letter also claims that you, Mr. Calloway, only agreed to the marriage as a temporary arrangement and that Mrs. Calloway has no actual claim to this property or means to support the children independently." "That's a lie," Alara said, voice shaking. "Then you won't mind answering some questions." Rhett's fists clenched. "Get off my land." "Mr. Calloway." "I said get off my land. You want to verify something? You go through the courthouse. You got questions about my marriage? You talk to the clerk who signed the papers. But you don't come to my home and accuse my wife of fraud." The man held up his hands. "I'm just doing my job." "Then do it somewhere else." The man hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be in touch." He mounted his horse and rode off, and Alara sank down onto the porch steps, shaking. "Who would do this?" she whispered. "Who would send that letter?" Rhett sat beside her, jaw tight with anger. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." The next day, Rhett rode into town and went straight to the courthouse. The clerk remembered them, and when Rhett explained what had happened, the man's face darkened. "Someone's trying to stir up trouble," the clerk said. "But your marriage is legal, recorded and filed. There's nothing they can do about that." "What about the boys?" "As long as you're married and can provide for them, they're yours. No one can take them away." Rhett felt some of the tension ease, but not all of it. "You got any idea who might have sent that letter?" The clerk shook his head. Could be anyone. Someone with a grudge, maybe, or someone looking to make trouble for their own reasons. Rhett left the courthouse and went to the orphanage, demanding to speak to the woman who ran it. She was the same one who'd been there when they'd picked up the boys, and her face was stern but not unkind. "I didn't send any letter," she said, "but I did receive one. Anonymous. Claimed your wife had deceived you into marriage and that the children were being neglected. That's not true. I didn't think it was, but I had to send someone to verify. It's policy." "Who sent the letter?"
I don't know. It wasn't signed. Rhett felt frustration rising. So someone out there is trying to destroy my family, and you can't tell me who. I'm sorry, Mr. Calloway. I truly am. But without a signature, there's nothing I can do. Rhett rode home angry and helpless, hating that someone could attack them like this, and he couldn't fight back. When he told Alara what he'd learned, she just nodded, face pale. "It doesn't matter who sent it," she said quietly. "What matters is they can't take the boys." "They can't. The marriage is legal. We're legal." "Then we move on." But it wasn't that easy. The fear lingered, shadowing every good moment, making them both jumpier, more protective. Rhett found himself watching the road more often, waiting for another stranger to ride up with more accusations. Alara started having nightmares again, waking in the middle of the night gasping, and Rhett would hold her until she calmed down. The boys noticed. Daniel asked one night if they were in trouble, and Rhett didn't know how to answer without lying. "Someone tried to cause problems," he said finally, "but it didn't work. You're safe." "You promise?" "I promise." Daniel nodded, but Rhett could see the doubt in his eyes, and it killed him that he couldn't erase it completely. A week later, Porter rode over and asked to speak to Rhett privately. They walked out to the barn, away from the house. "I heard what happened," Porter said. "The man from the orphanage. News travels fast." "It does. And I heard something else, too." Porter hesitated. "There's a man in town named Hackett. He's been buying up land, trying to push out the smaller ranchers. Rumor is he's been using dirty tactics, spreading lies, filing false claims, anything to get people to sell cheap." Rhett's jaw tightened. "You think he's behind this?" "I don't know, but it fits his pattern. He tried it with me last year, claimed I owed him money for water rights. It was all fabricated, but it cost me time and money to fight it." "Why would he go after us?" "Because you're vulnerable. New family, new marriage, kids from an orphanage. He probably figured it'd be easy to scare you into selling." Rhett felt anger burning hot in his chest. "Where can I find him?" "Rhett, don't Where?" Porter sighed. "He's got an office above the saloon, but going after him won't solve anything. He's got lawyers, money, connections. You go in there angry, you'll just make it worse." "So what do I do? Let him keep attacking my family?" "No. You fight smart. You document everything. You get people to testify to what he's done. You build a case and take him down legal." Rhett wanted to argue, to say that legal didn't always mean justice, but he knew Porter was right. Going after Hackett with his fists would only hurt Alara and the boys in the long run. "Fine," Rhett said. "I'll do it your way." "Good. And you're not doing it alone. I'll help. So will others. Hackett's made a lot of enemies. It's time someone stood up to him." Over the next few weeks, Rhett and Porter gathered evidence. They talked to other ranchers who'd been targeted, collected letters and documents, built a case that showed a pattern of harassment and fraud. When they had enough, they took it to the territorial marshal, a hard-eyed man named Brennan, who listened without interrupting. "This is solid," Brennan said when they finished. "I can bring him in for questioning." "Will it stick?" Rhett asked. "If your witnesses hold up, yeah, it'll stick." 2 days later, Hackett was arrested. Rhett wasn't there to see it, but Porter was, and he rode out to the ranch that evening with the news. "They got him," Porter said, grinning. "Took him in chains." Alara, standing beside Rhett on the porch, let out a breath she'd been holding for weeks. "Is it over?" "Not yet," Porter said. "There'll be a trial, but with what we've got, he's not walking away clean." Rhett nodded, feeling the weight lift just a little. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. You did the work. I just helped." After Porter left, Alara turned to Rhett. "You think it's really over?" "Yeah," Rhett said. "I think it is." She leaned against him and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. They stood like that for a long time, watching the sun set over the hills,
and Rhett felt something he hadn't felt in months: hope. The trial happened in late summer, and it was everything Porter had promised. Witness after witness testified to Hackett's tactics, his lies, his attempts to intimidate and defraud. When it was over, the judge sentenced him to 5 years in prison and ordered him to pay restitution to everyone he'd wronged. Rhett and Alara walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the future looked clear. "It's done," Alara said, almost disbelieving. "It's done," Rhett agreed. They rode home together, and when they pulled up to the ranch, the boys came running out, asking what had happened. Rhett told them, and Daniel's whole face lit up. "So no one can take us away?" he asked. "No one," Rhett said. "You're ours, for good." Thomas whooped and threw his arms around Rhett's waist, and Daniel followed, more reserved but no less relieved. Alara stood back, watching them, tears streaming down her face, and Rhett reached out and pulled her into the circle too. They stood there like that, the four of them, holding each other in the fading light, and Rhett felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. This was his family. This was his life, and no one was going to take it away. The years that followed were not without struggle. There were droughts that tested their endurance, winters that pushed them to the edge, moments when the work felt endless and the rewards too small. But they faced it together, and that made all the difference. Daniel grew into a man Rhett was proud of, strong, fair, with a sense of responsibility that ran deep. He took over more of the ranch work as Rhett's joints started to ache, and he did it without complaint, without resentment. He even started courting a girl from town, a quiet young woman named Mary, who came for dinner one Sunday and fit into their family like she'd always been there. Thomas stayed smaller, quicker, with a mind for numbers that surprised everyone. He started keeping the ranch books, tracking expenses and profits with an attention to detail that made Alara laugh. "He's the smart one," she said one evening, watching him work through calculations by lamplight. "They're both smart," Rhett said. "Just in different ways." Alara looked at him, smiling. "You know what I love about you?" "What?" "You see the best in people, even when they can't see it in themselves." Rhett didn't know what to say to that, so he just kissed her, and she kissed him back. And that was enough. The ranch grew over the years, slowly but steadily. They bought the land to the west, just like Rhett had planned, and expanded the herd. They hired a hand to help with the heavy work, a young man named Cole, who reminded Rhett of himself at that age. Rough around the edges, but willing to learn, Porter became more than a neighbor. He became a friend, stopping by for supper once a week, bringing news from town, sharing stories that made them all laugh. When he got sick one winter, Rhett and the boys took turns checking on him, making sure he had firewood and food, and when he recovered, he cried and said they'd saved his life. "Your family," Rhett said, embarrassed by the emotion. "Yeah," Porter said, wiping his eyes. "I guess I am." The garden flourished under Alara's care year after year, until it was the envy of everyone who saw it. She taught other women in town how to grow vegetables in the harsh soil, how to preserve food, how to make a little go a long way. She became someone people turned to for advice, for help, and Rhett watched her confidence bloom in a way that made his chest ache with pride. One evening, years after everything had started, Rhett and Alara sat on the porch watching the sunset. The boys were grown now. Daniel married with a child on the way, Thomas talking about going to school in the city to learn accounting. The house was quieter than it used to be, but it was still full of life. "You ever think about how it all started?" Alara asked. "Sometimes." "You regret any of it?" Rhett looked at her, at the lines around her eyes, the gray starting to thread through her hair, and felt a surge of love so strong it almost hurt. "Not a single second." She smiled, that same smile that had caught him years ago and never let go. "Me neither." They sat there as the sky turned purple, and the stars came out, and Rhett thought about the woman who'd shown up at his gate all those years ago, desperate and starving, asking for work. He thought about the choice he'd made to let her stay, and how that choice had led to everything that mattered. Life wasn't perfect. It never had been. There were still hard days, still moments of doubt and fear and frustration. But there was also laughter, warmth, connection. There was family, and that was enough. More than enough. "Rhett?" Alara said quietly. "Yeah? Thank you for everything." "You don't have to thank me." Yes, I do, because you gave me a chance when no one else would. You gave my boys a home. You gave me a life I didn't think I deserved. Rhett turned to her, taking her hand. You deserved it all along. You just needed someone to see it. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat there in comfortable silence, watching the world turn dark around them. And Rhett realized that this quiet moment, this simple peace, was what he'd been searching for his whole life without knowing it. Years later, when Daniel and Mary had their second child, they named him Rhett. And when Thomas came home from the city with a degree and a plan to help manage the ranch's finances, he said it was because he'd learned from the best. The ranch became a legacy, passed down through the family, growing and changing, but never losing the heart that Rhett and Alara had built into it. It became a place where people knew they could come when they had nowhere else to go, where hard work was respected and family was defined not by blood alone, but by choice and commitment. And when Rhett was old and gray, sitting on that same porch with Alara beside him, watching his grandchildren play in the yard, he thought about the woman who'd stood at his gate so long ago, the woman who'd asked for work and been given so much more, the woman who'd saved him just as much as he'd saved her. We did good, he said quietly. Alara squeezed his hand. We did better than good. We built something real. Yeah, Rhett said, smiling. We did. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, and Rhett closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of Alara's hand in his, the sound of children laughing, the solid weight of a life well lived. He'd started with nothing, a piece of land and a determination to survive. He'd ended with everything, family, love, purpose, legacy. It hadn't been easy, it hadn't been perfect, but it had been worth it, every single hard-won moment of it. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the struggles or the setbacks, but the choice to keep going, the choice to build something when it would have been easier to let it fall apart, the choice to love when it was safer to stay closed off. Rhett had made that choice. They all had. And it had changed everything. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of grass and earth and home, and Rhett breathed it in deep, holding it in his lungs like a promise. This was his land, his family, his life, and he wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Beside him, Alara sighed contentedly, and Rhett opened his eyes to look at her. She was older now, her face marked by time and weather and laughter and tears. But she was still the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. I love you, he said, because it never got old saying it. I love you too, she said, because it never got old hearing it. They sat there as the stars came out, one by one, filling the sky with light. And Rhett thought about all the people who'd helped them along the way, Porter, the clerk, the families in town, even the strangers who'd shown up when they needed help most. Community, he realized, wasn't just something that existed. It was something you built, one connection at a time. He thought about Daniel and Thomas, grown men now with lives of their own, and felt a fierce pride that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the years they'd spent together, learning and growing and becoming who they were meant to be. He thought about the ranch, the land he'd inherited and transformed, and knew it would outlast him. It would go on, generation after generation, a testament to what was possible when people refused to give up. And he thought about Alara, the woman who'd walked into his life when both of them were broken, and how they'd found a way to put each other back together. Not perfectly, not without scars, but whole enough to keep going, whole enough to build something beautiful out of the wreckage. That was the lesson, Rhett realized. That was what mattered. Not where you started, but what you chose to do with what you were given. Not the hand you were dealt, but how you played it. Not the past that haunted you, but the future you were willing to fight for. Life was hard. It was cruel sometimes, unforgiving, relentless. But it was also full of moments like this, sitting beside someone you loved, watching the sky change colors, knowing that tomorrow you'd wake up and do it all again. And that was enough. That was everything. Rhett squeezed Alara's hand and she squeezed back, and they sat there together as the night deepened around them. Two people who'd found each other in the wilderness and built a home out of nothing but grit and hope and stubborn, enduring love. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying stories of everyone who'd ever lived on this land, everyone who'd ever struggled and survived and tried to make something better. And Rhett added his story to theirs, knowing it would echo long after he was gone. This was his legacy, Not just the land or the ranch or the family name, but the choice to keep going when it would have been easier to quit. The choice to open his door when it would have been safer to keep it closed. The choice to love when it would have been less painful to stay alone. Those choices had made all the difference. Those choices had built a life. And as the last light faded from the sky and the stars burned bright overhead, Rhett Calloway closed his eyes and smiled, knowing that whatever came next, he'd lived a life that mattered. He'd been broken once. They all had. But together, they'd found a way to heal. Together, they'd built something that would last. And that was more than he'd ever dared to hope for.